This is The Dragon's Roar by Priestess of Groove, narrated by RileyRoxx. Chapter 29, Jamie 10. He awoke to the cool compress of stone beneath his face. His breathing was now slow and even, and he was loath to open his eyes. He could hear voices mumbling nearby, and despite the pain in his head, he strained to tune in. Is not a maester. You don't need to be a maester to be a healer. You're the maester for the Tyrells. I don't trust you to treat him and then not run off to the Tyrells what you've discovered. Maesters are assigned to keeps, not houses. Don't try and placate me with that bullshit. Maesters, more often than not, grow attached to the families they serve, and in turn do the Lord's bidding. I will not suffer it. It was then he felt a hand splay across his back and rub in a soothing motion. I think if the Lord Jamie were awake, he'd have a similar opinion to his uncle. Leave him to me. The healer David was speaking in low, soothing tones, and he could only imagine that the air would be filled with sound waves as blue as the sky. His breathing has changed. He's waking. Garyon, you know the rules. Wait outside. But David, if he wants to tell you what ails him, he will. But that's up to him to decide, not us. Now go. The door finally closed. David whispered, Lord Jamie, can you hear me? Jamie's thoughts were like fireflies that filtered around his skull, scattered. As soon as he thought he caught one, it seemed to slip through his fingers. He couldn't bring any of his thoughts to cohesion, so he just focused on David's voice. Yes, he whispered as softly as a sigh. How do you feel? He kept his eyes shut and twitched his muscles. A deep ache seemed to fill all of his muscles, and he groaned as the pain shot through him as he flexed. Like I've been run over by a horse. That sounds about right. How's your head? Painful. I want to sleep. Jamie heard the telltale scratching of quill on paper. A heat emanated from his right side, and he unconsciously sidled up to ease the chill that had swept him. Don't fall asleep, and don't sit up just yet. Do you remember what happened? He pinched his eyebrows and once again tried to catch his thoughts, despite the blacksmith that seemed to be hammering his skull. He was at the Tyrells. He had breakfast. They went to negotiations. His eyes flew open and he abruptly sat up. Pain pierced his skull like a knife had been driven onto it, and his stomach heaved. He vomited, groaned, and laid back down, clutching at his head, thankfully missing the puddle of vomit. David sighed. I said don't sit up. Honestly, you listen about as well as your uncle. When Jamie had settled again, he asked, When did you start having seizures? When the bear attacked me, Jamie mumbled. I wondered if that injury was more serious. Anything else? No, Jamie breathed. Somehow I don't believe you. That caused Jamie to open his eyes. He turned away from the sour mess of vomit and glared at David, who was taking notes in a tiny journal. When David finally saw his glare, he returned the gaze unflinchingly. I told you, I know how to read people. You're hiding something. A man in your position undoubtedly has many secrets. I know you're not going to tell me anything, though. So, let's just skip to your treatment. There's very little I can do. I do have a pain reliever that should help with your headache, but what you need, most of all, is rest. If you'd like, I can summon servants to carry you. I can walk, Jamie growled. He started leveraging himself to his feet and scowled as his legs trembled. He grabbed the chair he'd fallen out of for support and only began moving when he felt stable enough. David sighed again. Stubborn bastard. Jamie staggered for the door and had to stand for a moment as the world swayed before his eyes. When he had collected himself, he opened the door to find the Tyrells, Geryon, and Podrick all waiting outside. Geryon had an uncharacteristically dour expression. Podrick, too, had an oddly mullish look on his face. They all turned as he stepped out. "My lord, are you well?" Willis asked. His voice was a nervous pale yellow, and there was no mistaking the alarm in his eyes. "I will be fine," Jamie said. His voice was a croak, and it projected none of the strength he had hoped to. Did it really matter, now that the Tyrells knew he'd suffered seizures? "I apologize for the alarm I caused. We'll have to reschedule the negotiations for another time." He didn't bother waiting for their response, merely turned in the direction of his rooms and shuffled off. His uncle drew level with him as they walked. "What was that? What happened?" "Not now, uncle," Jamie groaned. Geryon sighed. "I know I have no right to ask for anything you're not willing to give, but please, consider filling me in. I want to help you." "There's nothing you can do about it." When they reached his room, he opened the door and said, "Good night, uncle." As he tried to close it, however, Geryon grabbed it. "We're family. I insist on staying at your bedside." "I'm going to be sleeping. I don't need a fucking wet nurse." For a moment they stood at the door with their eyes locked. "Don't mind him, Geryon. Seizures tend to cause severe mood swings," David said, sauntering up to them. He held out a small vial. "Take this. It will ease your headache. Normally I would say to take it with a meal, but—" He shrugged and wandered off as soon as Jamie took it. Jamie gave his uncle one last glare and turned away, leaving the door open and readied himself for bed. His uncle took the opportunity to step into the room. Jamie examined the potion critically. It was milky, with an odd blue coloring. He downed the potion and shuddered. It had a strangely bitter taste that seemed to leave grit in his mouth, changed clothes, and climbed into bed. "You're going to be bored sitting there." "Well then, I guess I'll be bored knowing my nephew is safe." "I'm not a child anymore." "You'll always be a child to me." The next afternoon found Jamie and Geryon once more sitting across the table from the Tyrells. His seizure, if anything, seemed to have unsettled them. Mace Tyrell was giving him an odd look. Willis had pity written all over his face, but Olenna was as emotionless as ever. Under normal circumstances, Jamie would be livid at receiving Willis's pity, but he'd learned from his previous life that such emotions could be used as leverage. Willis knew what it was to be a cripple, and he might therefore look at Jamie more as a kindred spirit than an enemy. It was something to work with. Now, where were we? Ah, yes, I do believe we were discussing the legitimacy of King Aemon Targaryen. I have more evidence. Jamie stood and reached for the harp case that was propped up in the seat next to him. He had completely forgotten about the harp in the wake of his impending seizure, and remembered it first thing in the morning. He deftly undid the latches and revealed the harp. Willis gasped. "Is that? What is it, son?" Olenna was unmoved. "This is Prince Rhaegar's treasured harp," Willis replied, sounding breathless. "That's right," Jamie said. It escaped King Robert's rampage?" "Indeed. Lord Stark had it this whole time." Seems passing odd for the prince to leave this most treasured harp with a kidnapped woman, Elena said, as she was eyeing the harp critically. May I? Willis asked, reaching for the harp. Jamie frowned but nodded. All the same, his heart contracted as the harp was lifted from its case, as though he expected Willis to smash it. But the young lord wasn't Joffrey, and he held it like it was made of glass. Exquisite craftsmanship. Willis plucked at its strings, and the notes it produced quivered green in the air for Jamie. Am I right that Lord Stark had it this whole time? Olenna said. That is correct, my lady. Lord Stark took it with him, as well as the babe, a Targaryen, and his sister's bones. I always heard he raped her. She was gauging his reaction. He flicked his eyes down to her coldly. You forgot, my lady. I was a member of the King's Guard when Rhaegar was still alive. Unlike his father, he was not capable of rape. How can I trust your judgment, King's Slayer? Her voice was orange with challenge. I was wondering how long it would take you to wield that, Jamie replied, his voice having taken on a color of dark red. I am the Kingslayer no longer. King Aemond has pardoned me of that. A king we may not recognize the legitimacy. Of the people he could have sent, why did he send you? They were all watching him. Mace Tyrell was quiet for once, and he wondered if his mother and son ordered him not to speak at all. Jamie actually smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. It was as cold as a winter's night. Because I am a Lannister, my lady, and we always pay our debts. One way or another, you will bend the knee. The tension was such that Jamie thought for a moment the strings on the harp might snap, but in the next moment, Olenna nodded and said, I had to know what we were dealing with. You've changed, Lord Jaime Lannister. Your blood used to run as hot as a raging bull's. You seem to have taken a page out of your father's book. Jaime's insides squirmed at being compared to his father, but he hoped it didn't show. He sat back down again and said, Now that we have that out of the way, let's discuss terms. Mace Tyrell bristled. Wait a moment. We haven't even decided to pledge our allegiance to you. All eyes turned to him at once, and he cowed, even under the gaze of his own son and mother. Don't be a fool, Mace. The dragon already has the North, the Riverlands, the Westerlands, and likely the Vale. I've heard a rumor that Dorne might even be appeased enough to join when they receive the mountain. If that happens, we will be the odd one out. A king will take notice of that, Lady Olenna said. Especially if he offered an alliance once, and we rejected it. Mace sputtered for a moment, and then cried. What about my son? What about Loras? Willis sighed, and his shoulders slumped. As much as I love my brother, he should have returned when we commanded him to, and he didn't. He made his bed, and now he shall lie in it. Mace looked flabbergasted. Jaime hoped the astonishment didn't show on his face. They seemed rather callous, just throwing Sir Loras under. But he had a feeling his own father would have done the same in regards to either Tyrion or Cersei if the situation had arisen. I suppose it did arise, but that was taken entirely out of my father's hands, Jaime thought soberly. Whatever was here, Jaime had a feeling that Loras's pleas had been endlessly debated among family members, to the point where it was now a tired topic. Apart from the betrothals you've proposed, what are your terms? Willis asked. He looked pale but resolute. There's only one stipulation regarding the marriages. Robb Stark and Marjorie are of age at 6 and 10. Lady Sansa, however, is only 4 and 10, and Lord Stark wishes the betrothal to stay in place until she's 6 and 10. Jaime replied. That's more than fair. Anything else? Jaime considered him for a moment and said, I'm prepared to offer the Tyrells a seat on the small council. However, I have one condition. It must be filled by you, Lord Willis. Willis blinked in astonishment. Me? Yes, I must insist, Jaime said. He and Aemon had discussed small council positions, and Jaime relented at the tale of how Mace Tyrell ended up as master of ships. They'd rather not have that buffoon in charge of anything larger than a dog kennel. Olenna nodded with a pleased smile. I see the king already has good sense. Willis contemplated for a moment, and then said, I just have 2 demands. And they are? We demand that either a daughter of mine or a daughter of Marjorie's be betrothed to Aemon Targaryen's heir. Jaime's lips curled in the sneer. That's awfully bold. I'm not comfortable bargaining the king's future heirs. If that is a demand you want considered, you'll have to bring it up with him and Robb Stark. Next demand. Willis's frowns deepened, but he conceded with a small nod. We will not accept a denial of this one. You will not harm my brother Sir Loras Tyrell. There's the family protectiveness, Jaime thought, and his expression softened. I will personally guarantee that Sir Loras will not come to harm, though it is up to you to curb any future foolish tendencies. Lady Olenna's eyebrows raised. Personally? I'd be curious to see how you achieve that. Jaime's eyes were like chips of stone. I will not fail. Once the negotiations were finalized, they broke for lunch, and then Willis retired to the solar to write letters and call up the banners. It would take at least 2 weeks for everyone to arrive. The Red Wines were commanded to sail to King's Landing. Even though their ships would reach Blackwater Bay, hopefully long after the Red Keep was taken. Robert had, among other things, squandered the funds for the upkeep of the Navy. They would need at least a few ships on hand in the event that Stannis decided to sail for King's Landing, as he had previously. Jaime sent a letter to River Run in hopes that Aemon would receive it. The news of the alliance had also prompted a frenzy of activity from the shepherds. They managed to secure a work area from the Tyrells. The men, and even a few women on hand, including Delphine, worked tirelessly with the herbs and ingredients, boiling mixtures and water. Jaime asked David what was going on. The old healer was looking manic, and he seemed to bristle at the interruption. We're going to war. There's going to be injuries, and we'll need potions. Now, out. We're busy. He was shoved rather unceremoniously out the door, though it was not closed. Callum stood guard outside, and gave him a smile and a bewildered shrug. I recommend you stay out of David's way. He heeds no one when he gets like this. Geryon and yet another shepherd mercenary, named Joffrey, were set to watch the children. Geryon was in the midst of training the twins, Monty and Matthias, swordplay. As there was very little else to do, Jaime watched and felt his fingers twitch. He was itching to get in some sword fighting. Geryon seemed to sense his mood and asked for a spar. Jaime obliged. His uncle had clearly picked up some new moves and styles of fighting being across the sea for so long, and Jaime was impressed with the fight he put up, almost catching him off guard a time or two. And still, Jaime took the fight. The commotion had attracted the ladies in the High Garden, and it seemed a good portion of them swooned when he defeated his uncle. Marjorie wasn't among the swooning, but she applauded all the same, and showered him with compliments. He spent much of the rest of the week in the training ring, continuing with Pod's squireship, and getting wrangled into showing the twins the basics as well. He greeted some of the lords when they showed up, chief among them Lord Tarley and his son Dickon. He was polite and remembered the son's name. He had been working hard to rein in the Lannister arrogance. It could be useful for posturing, but Aemon needed a hand who didn't belittle his allies. Even so, he was rather gruff with the Tarleys. He disliked how Randall Tarley had treated his firstborn, Samwell. Although a little bumbling and rambled entirely too much for his own good, he had been a well-meaning lad with an unparalleled knowledge of history and the lore surrounding the Long Night that quite simply had come in useful. And of course, he was the last person alive with any kind of healing knowledge, sticking with him to the very end, despite his self-proclaimed cowardness. He hadn't deserved his fate to be stuck at the wall. He and Aemon had discussed changing it, but ultimately had decided he would prove more useful at the wall to take Maester Aemon's place as he had before. And Tarley also reminded him a little too much of his own father. Finally, just when Jaime was starting to get antsy from Aemon's lack of response, Willis came to him and said,
"Lord Jaime, we're ready. We leave for King's Landing at dawn."